A very warm welcome to this morning's session, an induction to higher education governance for new governors. My name's Aaron Porter. I'm the Associate Director Governance at Advance HE. And in addition to that, I'm a board member at two quite different UK universities. So I sort of get to see this from both sides of the fence. So I'm chair of the board of BPP University, a university that largely focuses on law and business and a little bit of healthcare. And then I'm deputy chair of Goldsmiths, part of the University of London. A university that's more focused on sort of arts and humanities, some social sciences. So two very different institutions. In my role with Advance HE, over the course of a typical year, we might engage with about 700 members of university governing bodies, boards, councils, courts, through a range of different sessions. So some which are quite focused on governors at a particular point in their journey. So like today, towards the beginning, for most of you, I imagine, right through to sessions with chairs of governing bodies. And then sometimes we also focus on thematic areas. So that might be kind of financial issues in higher education or oversight of academic quality and standards and so on. For those of you that don't know Advance HE, and many of you are new to the sector, there's no reason that you would do. It's a sector body, so it's owned by the representative bodies of UK higher education, but it's also a membership organisation. So institutions both in the UK, where most of our members are, but also a good number of international universities from beyond the UK. And there are three main areas of focus for us as an organisation. The first is support for the executive leadership of institutions, so a lot of support in that area, but also for governance and governors as well. The second area is around both understanding and trying to support improvements in relation to diversity and inclusion in higher education. And the third area is support around the delivery of good practice in relation to student experience and academic matters as well. So just by way of introduction, a lot of you have kindly typed in who you are and where you're from different institutions, and you'll see just scanning through that list, we've got a range of people in different sorts of roles from a range of different institutions, indeed right across the UK. We've got a good number of you who are independent or lay or external governors, but also a small number of staff governors. And I think we might also be having, I don't know if they're here as yet, I think we might have one or two student governors as well. So I think the day will be richer for having governors from different both kind of perspectives and backgrounds, but also from very different sorts of institutions as well, from kind of large research intensive multi-faculty universities through to smaller, more specialist institutions. So again, if you glance through the list, you'll get a sense of who's here. One bit of kind of two bits of housekeeping briefly to mention. The first is actually in just relation to kind of terminology. Obviously, this is a session for those of you who are newer, and we'll come on to some of that in a second. And one thing that's always quite interesting about higher education is sometimes different words are used to describe quite similar things. And that's certainly the case in governance. Quite central to that is even the word that is used to describe your governing body varies from institution to institution. I'm largely just going to use the catch-all term governing body because that is the most straightforward way of describing it. But of course, in your institutions, you might be referring to the council. Typically in older universities, it might be the board. In newer universities, in Scotland, it's generally referred to as the court. There are a few institutions who refer to it as the trustee board or the board of trustees. So there's slightly different terms used in different places, but rather than me going council, court, board, I'll use the governing body. And there'll be a couple of other things that as we go through the day, we will make sure we're clear about the words that we're using because it might have a slightly different label in your institution. Just before we kind of kick into the sessions properly, we I thought it might be helpful just to get a little bit of a feel for who's with us today, beyond just simply saying which institution you're at. So I'm going to launch four very quick fire questions, but it will just give us a flavour of a little bit about your experience for those of you that are in the room. So hopefully those questions have launched on the screen. And the first one just asks you how many governing body meetings you've been to so far. Obviously, this is a session aimed at newer members, but there'll within that be a little bit of a variety. So just to kind of get a little bit of a handle on that. Some of you have mentioned this in your introduction, but just to get a bit of a feel for what sort of role you've got, whether that's as a independent or lay governor, external governor, staff student, and if we've got anyone else here as well. A third question, which I appreciate some of you will be in differing degrees of getting to know the institution, but how you've rated your induction, and that will be perhaps the things that you've had internally provided by the university or the institution, and maybe anything else that you've had on top of that. And then finally, just out of interest, because I think it is a helpful thing to have had, whether you've had a one-to-one with the chair. So most people have answered most of the questions. There's just a couple more to go, and I'll just share the results in 1 second. Right, I think that's nearly everyone, pretty much everyone. So let me just end the poll and just share the results. Just so you've got a sense of who else is here. So we've got quite a split in terms of how many governing body meetings people have been to so far. A few of you haven't been to any so far, which is absolutely fine. Just over half of you have been to one or two, which I think will be helpful because you'll have a couple of points of reference, but it's not a problem that, as I say, for those of you that haven't been to any as yet. And then there's, again, a few of you who have maybe had 3 or 4, but you might still be in your first year with 4 meetings. And then there's a very small number of you who have had over 5. That might mean you're still kind of towards the end of the first year or the beginning of the second year in a kind of typical cycle of meetings. That's one of those other things that varies from institution to institution. I know that there are a couple of institutions, I don't know quite how they manage this, who just have 3 scheduled governing body meetings over a year, 1 a term. But I think it's much more common to have kind of around 5 or 6 is the kind of conventional number for most UK universities. So sort of 5 governing body meetings, normal business meetings, and 1 away day. That's the sort of usual setup. But there are some, I know there was a couple of universities that moved to, one moved to monthly board meetings. I know there's another that has 10. So there's a little bit of variety, and we'll say a little bit about kind of why things are done slightly differently. You can see in terms of background of governors, the majority of you are independent, external or lay members, but it's also great that we've got some members of staff who are also governors, doing it alongside their day job. Couple of students and also some governance professionals. I think, again, having a blend of different roles, I think will enrich the contributions that we get. Good news for those of you that have had an induction. Generally, people have found that to either be excellent or good. A couple of you have had a less good experience, but hopefully this might even just give you some pointers for things to go back to the institution and maybe just ask for it to be supplemented in a different way. And then finally, on the last question, just over 2/3 of you have had a one-to-one with the chair, which I think is a really helpful thing, both to kind of to hear from them their perspectives on governance and to build that relationship with them, but also just under 1/3 of you haven't, and again that may be something that you want to go back to the institution and suggest. I think it is a very good thing to have, particularly in the first year. I might also go on to say that really I think there should be an annual conversation between all governors and the chair, just as a kind of good practice. Quite a few institutions will have a light touch approach for what might be called appraisal or review, but just an informal conversation on an annual basis. If we could just move on, Patrick, to the agenda slide. Thank you very much. So this is just an overview of what we're going to cover through the day. We're going to try and cover a fair amount in 3 hours, but I would also say that there's only so much that we can do in 3 hours. But we're certainly going to endeavour to more than dip our toe into the water in sort of four key areas that I think are particularly of interest to governors. The first is around understanding the higher education policy environment. And I think this is always quite an interesting thing for people that are new to governing bodies, and particularly if you're new to higher education. But I think it's particularly pertinent right now because, of course, we've had a change of a Westminster government. Some matters are UK-wide, particularly in the kind of research and innovation space. Other matters in terms of teaching and teaching funding are obviously reserved matters for the governments in Wales and Scotland. But nonetheless, I think a change of UK government has profound implications in England for higher education and where it's going. But I think there are still wider areas of relevance for the colleagues that are joining from beyond England as well. But trying to get a little bit of a handle on what are the key areas of higher education policy that's being worked on, and where there's been some recent changes, both from the last government and signs of change from this new government, and what we can expect to come down the track. We're then going to move on to something which I think is more directly relevant to you as governors, which is to get a bit of a handle on understanding your role and responsibilities. What are the regulatory expectations on your governing body as a whole, and some that are specifically on you? How does that kind of manifest itself in practice? So a little bit of kind of how the nuts and bolts of governance works. This is the sort of stuff that hopefully would have been covered to some degree in your kind of local induction, but giving you a flavour of how it's done across the UK so you can compare and contrast, I hope will be useful. We'll take a short break at around 11:45. And then in the final hour, we're going to cover a couple of other things in a relatively quick fire fashion, but I hope you'll find them interesting. So the first will be to get a little bit of an oversight on the experience of students studying in higher education. So what are some of the data that exists around that? How do governing bodies try and engage with the student experience? And I think for those of you that have been to a few governing body meetings, you might have your own expectations about how well the experience of students is both covered and discussed at the governing body. Obviously, it's competing for time with lots of other matters. You know, financial matters are clearly quite pressing for lots of universities right now, but also how it balances alongside kind of regulation and other, matters that require the attention of the board. And then we'll finish off with a little bit of a kind of an insight on what the shape and size of governance is in UK higher education. And then we'll finish the day with a panel of two experienced governors just sharing some reflections on how they found their roles, offering some advice to those of you that are new, and they'll say a little bit more about themselves when we get there. Through the day, each of the speakers have kindly said that they'll try and make sure that they leave some time for questions at the end. So if there's anything that as presenters are speaking that you want to clarify or want to follow up on, do feel free to use the chat function to ask those questions. We might deal with the questions at the end of the session rather than as they're going through, but we'll keep an eye on those questions. So do feel free to contribute as we're going. The second thing that I'll say is that I think a number of our speakers are going to use slides. So we will circulate the slides after the session, probably later today or tomorrow. So again, if you see something on the slide and you don't get a chance to jot it down, you'll get to see the slides afterwards. So hopefully that will be useful. And then just as a little bit of housekeeping, additionally, if you get any tech issues as we go through the day, then my colleague is logged in, and he'll be able to provide you with some support. I'm just He's logged in as with his name, so Patrick Owen. So if there's any sort of questions or sort of tech issues as you've got as we go, if you want to send a direct message, a chat message to Patrick, he's probably the best person to help you in the first instance. And if he can't help you, we'll try and find someone that can. The sort of final thing to say is that yeah, there's a question that's just come up in the chat. So we will circulate the presentations after today, so probably this afternoon or into tomorrow. So if you miss any of the slides or there's something you don't get to scribble down, then they'll be with you afterwards. We will also record each of the presentations. That's only to circulate to. There's a small number of people who wanted to attend but couldn't make it as live. So if we've had people that have registered for the event but can't make this specific slot, then we'll send them the presentations. It's not going to be sort of widely distributed beyond that. But again, if you wanted to kind of go back to a particular session, if you did find any of them particularly interesting, then we would provide them to you as well. So I just wanted to mention that if you see that any of the sessions are being recorded, it's not that we're going to kind of publicize them more broadly. And we also would turn off the recording when we get to questions and answers as well. So that's just a little bit of info in terms of the logistics. Great. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say by way of introduction. As I say, if you've got any questions as we go, feel free to reach out. And certainly if you've got questions for the speakers, do feel free to ask those. They're very much encouraged, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'm going to just move us on to our first sort of session proper, as it were, and hearing a little bit about the policy environment. I'm really delighted we're able to be joined by Rachel Hewitt, who's the Chief Executive of Million Plus, and I'm sure Rachel will say a little bit about who Million Plus are and where they come from in terms of their member institutions. And as I mentioned right at the very start of the session, I think understanding what's going on in higher education policy is a really important thing for governors to get your head around, particularly those of you that are new to the sector, but doing so at a time of a change of government, I think makes it particularly interesting because there's certainly a lot going on. So I won't hold up things anymore. Thanks to Rachel for joining us, and I'll hand over to her now.
Brilliant. Well, good to be with you all, and yeah, thank you for the invitation to join today. As Aaron says, I'm going to talk through the sort of policy picture, I think, where we are at the moment in terms of higher education policy, and some hints about where I think things might be going in terms of the future direction. But I'll just briefly touch first on sort of who Million Plus are, because I'm Chief Executive of Million Plus as an organisation. So we're a membership organisation with 22 member institutions, I think some of whom are governors from some of whom are here today. And in terms of my background, I've previously worked at the Higher Education Policy Institute and the Higher Education Statistics Agency, but I'm also a governor myself as well at Leeds Beckett University, so understand that sort of overarching perspective that you all have as well. And Million Plus, in terms of the organisation, our role really is to bring together our members and provide opportunities for them to share their experiences at Vice Chancellor and at senior level through our networks, to promote the work that the universities that we represent do and raise the profile of modern universities. And I'll talk a bit about what makes a modern university from my perspective. Advocate for our members with parliamentarians and policymakers, and also provide evidence on the role of modern universities. And that's something we do through the sorts of reports and stats that we put out, as well as our wider blogs and other communications pieces. Next slide, please. So this gives a sense of who our members are. And as I say, some governors here, I think, are from some of our member institutions today. So we've got over 20 member institutions across England and Scotland. But they're quite a range in terms of the size of institution and the kind of regional spread. But coming on to the things that sort of unite those members and is the shared missions that we talk about, and partly it's helpful to refer to these because it helps inform the kind of position that I'm coming from and thinking about the different policy aspects itself. So we talk about our members having 6 shared missions. They're quite often very locally focused, so they're placemakers in their local area, have a real focus in both recruiting local students and supporting them to get jobs locally often afterwards, but also the kind of wider civic role of the institutions. They work collaboratively with business, and they also boost the public sector workforce, so train a lot of teachers and nurses. Driving social mobility, so that widening access feature is a real core aspect of everything that the institutions do. They're research informed compared to some other institutions that are research intensive, but often that research they're doing is very applied and focused in different innovative areas. Very forward looking, and you might find this within your own institution. Sometimes I think universities can be talked about as being slightly stuck in the past. I think actually lots more institutions now are much more forward looking and responsive to change. And finally, that mission around delivering excellent teaching, which provides students with the skills to succeed and go on and do their best in their future endeavours. So those are the things that unite million-plus institutions and how we describe them as sort of modern universities. But coming on to talk a bit about the next slide, please. Reflecting on one of the things that makes up a big piece about what million-plus do is our work, as I said, trying to influence policy on behalf of our members and being out there. And that's one of the things that's taken up a lot of my time recently has been going to the political party conferences, which is a part of what we do to engage with the debates going on within higher education across the different political parties. So we've just been at the SNP party conference, Lib Dems, Conservatives, and at Labour. And I just wanted to start with some reflections on what the kind of themes we heard coming out of those was. So I think starting with kind of opposition parties and the SNP as well, I think there was a much more limited there's a more limited focus on higher education among those groups. And that's one of the things I guess we'll come on to talk about in terms of the kind of risks for higher education, of who's making the case in government for the kind of key role that higher education plays. And some of the rhetoric still going on within Conservatives, as sort of the main opposition, was very much a focus in the discussions that were being had on non-higher education roles. So people, whether there are too many people going to university, and actually a sort of more focus on skills and further education side of the piece. But thinking about the Labour conference, obviously most to take away from there, given they're new in government, although still feels like a lot of kind of reading between the lines for higher education. So universities at Labour were receiving more positive recognition than they did probably under the last government. And even at events that weren't held on universities specifically, there was more mention of the role of universities in economic growth, and the Education Secretary and the Universities Minister recognised the need for universities as part of the opportunity mission that they've got as well. But I think from that, there's still a lot that's unknown about what they see universities' role as and how they ensure that they're properly funded. So feels like at the moment we're kind of reading between the lines from that front. Next slide, please. But some of the areas of government policy that we have had some early hints around, and particular kind of areas maybe that aren't just about universities, but areas that will knock on to impact universities. One of those is the development of this new body, Skills England. So the way that Skills England is described by the government is that it will bring together the fractured skills landscape and create shared national ambition to boost the nation's skills. And really that's seen as helping to support local areas, so feeding into the wider government missions around devolution to develop the skilled workforces that they need. So thinking about what universities' role is within this, well, actually, at the moment, that's not wholly clear in terms of how that's going to pan out. But I think it's a very important thing that we have a role and we make sure that we're part of the picture on that. So sometimes when people talk about skills, both in this government and in previous governments, there's been a kind of greater focus on colleges and further education than there has been on higher education. And this was consistent with the first report that Skills England have recently put out, which talks about the need for kind of below degree level skills, which of course is an important area, but I think it's important to also make sure that higher education is part of that picture. There's research showing that 88% of new jobs will need those higher level graduate skills by 2035. So universities have a key role to play in that, and it's important that we make sure that that message is picked up. Next slide, please. And one other early intervention we've seen from the new government was around university regulation and the role of the Office for Students. And they kind of took immediate action on this as there was free speech legislation brought in by the previous government that was due to start on the 1st of August, but still had quite a lot of threads kind of left loose that needed to be tied up. And quite a lot of concern, I think, within universities and within student unions around how that would be implemented and what was needed to be put in place to kind of manage the level of change that that legislation was looked at. So the early announcement that we heard from the government on that was around pausing the work on free speech. So that at the moment isn't being taken forward, waiting for further clarity on what that looks like longer term. They also appointed a new interim chair for the Office for Students, and the previous chair stood down when there was a change in government, and refocusing the work of the Office for Students to focus much more on financial sustainability, and financial sustainability, a big topic that I'm going to come on to talk about a bit further. So the chair that they've appointed, Sir David Bean, led the independent review, which is the second review reference there, which concluded in the summer. And I think has largely been a helpful place for the kind of future of regulation. Those of you who've been governors for some time might know that there's been kind of more challenging relationships with the OFS and the ways that the regulator has been operating. And that's something that was explored in the report that's referenced on the left here, which was part of a House of Lords inquiry into the Office for Students, and something I gave evidence to around the need for a change in regulation and adapting to that. So some positive moves in terms of the kind of areas that the Office for Students has been asked to focus on. And I think probably we've seen some positive moves in terms of the way that the regulator is responding to that, and they're doing work at the moment on the new strategy. But it's difficult to see so far how far the recommendations have been implemented. And I think it's fair to say there's still more work to be done in terms of if they were to narrow their focus onto financial sustainability of institutions, actually which areas are they going to stop doing more work in. So they've had an increased scope in recent years, both with things like this free speech legislation and also work on things like sexual harassment and in other areas. So that scope has been widened, and it'll be interesting to see what steps are taken forward in terms of if they are to kind of narrow that and reduce the burden of regulation on institutions. Next slide, please. Coming on to talk about financial sustainability and why I think it's important that this is an area that the government, and why the government have seen it as an important area for the Office for Students to refocus their efforts on. I mean, I think it's really coming up as the kind of #1 issue among almost all institutions over the last few years. We've certainly had a significantly more interest from journalists, and I think it's reached the public domain more in terms of an understanding that universities are in a really difficult financial place, and that will differ across different types of institutions, but there are some kind of key themes that come up across that. In terms of what's needed and action around that, well, there's been some ideas put out into the public domain, and if you've not seen it before, this Universities UK blueprint, as they've termed it, is worth a look in terms of some of the ideas that are being put forward about the ways in which universities and the government can work together to ensure the kind of long-term prosperity of universities. And that's floated ideas like looking at what it would actually cost to fully fund a course now, and coming up with a figure of around 12,500, which was kind of in the public debate and in the media for a while in the last few weeks. But looking into some of the detail of that on the next slide, please. So this is from the sort of breakdown of the different ways in which universities are funded and the different kind of streams of income that they have available to them. And I think this is worth thinking about in terms of thinking about how things got so difficult with financial sustainability for institutions. So fees for home students, so that first dark blue bar, is the kind of deficit by activity. Each bar is the deficit or surplus by activity, and that first blue bar looks at the kind of income that universities get for teaching home students. And those fees have been frozen for a number of years now. They were frozen at 9,000 since 2012 and went up just slightly to 9,250 in 2017. But obviously at the same time as that, we've seen the costs for institutions go up. So there's been the impacts of COVID, the impacts of the cost of living crisis and the increased costs that that's led to for institutions. So the ways in which they have to, the kind of costs that they've got to pay compared to their income is much more limited. So that first bar is around teaching home students. The next is around teaching international students. So universities do make surplus in terms of the international students that they teach. But this is something that's subject to government policy, and I'll come on to talk about that a bit more. But it's been difficult in the last few years in terms of changing government and them being part of the wider immigration debates, international students being brought into that. And that's also something that's quite different across different types of institutions who might recruit from different markets in terms of international students, some of which are more subject to flux than others, or some might have lower numbers of international students than others. And the third bar is the deficit for institutions by research. So this has always operated at a loss, and it's worth saying that the university funding model has always operated and relied on cross-subsidy. But what we can see is actually where universities are making a loss now in teaching home students, they're making a loss in terms of their research that they're doing. The only limited ways in which they have to kind of bring in income is through that international students bar, and that can't help to offset all of the challenges that are faced among that. And the final two bars are just around other income generating activities. So that's generally conferences and catering and those sorts of things. And the red one is non-commercial activities. So that's around investments, endowments and donations. Obviously, some institutions have more access to some of those than others. So I think it's a really challenging picture, and probably worth also saying that this chart's focused on England and Northern Ireland, but actually very similar challenges, and in some ways even greater challenges in Scotland, similar challenges faced in Wales around kind of frozen fees. So if you could just click on, please. So in terms of the answers to what happens next, well, there's rumours that are circulating around possible increase in fees. So government looking to gradually increase fees that students get for teaching home students, and among that being a package around maintenance support, so the support that students get while they're studying as well. But it's worth saying there's nothing around that that's confirmed so far. We're kind of waiting to see what comes further on that. And also the kind of solution that's being talked about, so this is a piece from the Times, I think last week, is only a kind of gradual increase. And you can see that actually the kind of long-term freeze that we've had on fees has led to a bigger challenge in terms of the wider model. And whilst a kind of short-term fix may help, there's a longer-term issue that needs to be resolved around the wider picture of financial sustainability. Next slide, please. So just coming back to international student policy. So as I said, international students have been subject to government policy and wider conversations around immigration policy in the last few years, and there were some changes that caused issues with recruitment of international students, particularly a change in policy around postgraduate students being allowed to bring dependents with them when they study. But we've seen with the new government a change in rhetoric around this. So this is a message from a Bridget Phillipson speech given early in her time in post, the Education Secretary. But as you can see from the headline below that, which is from just a couple of from last week, there's still been a challenging time in terms of most institutions and international student recruitment. Now, that's partly, I think, because of the time in which this messaging from the new government came, maybe wasn't quite quick enough to be able to do something around changing international students' perspective on how welcoming the UK is and how the UK is as a market compared to other places they could go to study in the world. We know there are some sort of positive hints from the new government around them looking at things like the international education strategy and possibly doing an update to that, which hints in the right direction. However, I think we shouldn't be complacent about this area, because there's a possibility that this is actually the most positive place we'll see the new government being in on international students. And actually, when issues of immigration start to come up as a kind of public debate again, international students may get drawn into those conversations as part of the wider migration statistics. So something to just be mindful of, that I don't think we can be complacent about things just getting better on the international students front in terms of the policy. Next slide, please. So just briefly coming on to research and the government's kind of commitments they've made around research. There's not tons to work on, I think, at the moment in terms of the ways in which the government have said that research policy is going to go. So this is the manifesto commitment that Labour made, which was largely around technical things around the kind of longer term, the funding cycles for institutions and looking at a longer term picture. But the other area that they've kind of hinted on was around kind of a closer link with their focus on research to the key government missions that they've set up. And I think those things, as with lots of other things they're doing, are going to be very closely aligned. And there'll also probably be more to see on this when we start to see the government developing their industrial strategy and the role that universities have to play in terms of both research and also on a wider basis around that. So not tons to say on that one at the moment, but probably more to come down the line on that front, and nothing kind of deeply concerning in that space at the moment. Next slide, please. I wanted to kind of, so we're on day 97 of the new government. We're nearly at that first 100 days point that people always talk about. And I just wanted to draw on a policy document that Million Plus put out just after the election. And this was areas we were thinking that we wanted the government to focus on in the first 100 days to make positive changes for universities. So the first around that was around changing the rhetoric on universities, so recognising the positive role that universities have to play, and that also being part of the picture in terms of international students. We've seen a bit of a kind of bashing of universities, conversations around Mickey Mouse courses, which unhelpful, and we wanted a kind of reset and refresh in terms of that approach for universities. We also wanted them to recommit to widening participation and thinking about reintroducing maintenance grants, so ensuring that students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds have the support that they need through their studies. Thinking about that issue of stabilising higher education finances, which, as we've said, are one of the kind of key issues for universities, and we talked about them setting up a task force to look into that in detail. Working with universities and the Office for Students to deliver genuinely risk-based regulation, so trying to reduce some of that regulatory burden and the pressures that universities are currently facing around that. And that's one way in which the government could help. Not only are we talking about them possibly increasing the income for universities, but also reducing some of the costs, some of the money that's spent on needing to respond to regulation. And also a specific ask around maintaining funding for BTECs and other qualifications which allow people to enter higher education, because there's been some change and kind of turmoil in that area in recent months. And so next slide, please. This is my traffic light system assessment of where we are, and apologies if anyone's colourblind, but I will say which where I think we are with each of them. So I think on the first, in terms of the change in the rhetoric, the positive action, we've seen some good work on that in terms of recognising the key role that universities have to play. There's also been some positive rhetoric in terms of the kind of widening participation and social mobility aspect of higher education, but we haven't yet seen any action around things like reintroducing maintenance grants. I think on stabilising higher education finances, there is probably thought going on within the government on this factor, but I don't think we've seen the kind of evidence of that at the moment. And equally, some kind of changes around regulation, which are starting to come into play, but probably more to be done on that one, and more to be done on the BTEC aspect as well. Next slide, please. So I think just thinking about that issue of, those key policies and the things we think that government need to be doing around higher education, it's worth also thinking about how much of a priority higher education is going to be for the new government. And worth noting that I think it's challenging. It's a challenging environment to make the case among competing priorities. So some of those I put down the right-hand side, schools, challenges around prisons, the NHS, housing. There are lots of key issues holding the government's attention at the moment. And I think it's really important that higher education shows its support in helping to meet the government's wider aims and their missions around opportunity and growth in order to ensure we're part of conversations and the needs that higher education have been addressed. It is worth saying that they put in some kind of big hitters in terms of the ministerial roles that support universities. So Jackie Smith has been made Minister for Skills, and Patrick Vallance, Minister for Science, Research and Innovation. So they'll both be holding the university's brief, and I think good to see those kind of the government placing an importance on the kind of people they put into those positions. Next slide, please. So what comes next on policy front? Well, I think we're all really waiting to see what comes around the autumn budget, which comes on October the 30th, and whether we see any change in terms of higher education, and particularly on the funding side around then. But also we'll then be looking at the kind of spending review process, which kicks off after the autumn budget and is due to conclude by the spring, and that sets the kind of budgets for government departments and will help to kind of set the future funding spends for the next few years to come. So there are lots to kind of see and lots to come on those fronts, I think. Next slide, please. I just want to conclude by talking a bit about students, because I've talked about lots of policies that impact universities and students by association, but just wanted to talk in a bit more detail about students themselves. So this chart looks at admissions in recent years, and the the bars on the left talk about the results day, but actually that's not necessarily the point at which we kind of judge how admissions have played out now, because so many more students are involved in the clearing process. So the charts on the right-hand side show the results 15 days after results day, as more people have gone through that clearing process and taken up more places. And you can see that these are across the years. COVID slightly distorts the figures in terms of higher numbers of students within the kind of COVID impact period going into higher education. But actually, compared to a pre-COVID time, figures are up in terms of students entering higher education. But it's worth noting that there's differences among different types of institution on that front. So the numbers of students at higher tariff institutions, so those who take students with the highest grades, are up 8%, but those who among middle tariff or lower tariff institutions are down 1% and 4% respectively. So some institutions have taken much higher numbers of students this year, whereas other institutions have had a more difficult time in terms of recruitment. So it will depend on your type of institution, how that's panned out. Next slide, please. And just breaking that down by disadvantage. So the chart on the left looks at polar is the description of the participation, numbers of students participating within the local area. So that top line is the areas where most students go into higher education, the highest number of students, proportion of students in that area go into higher education. And the bottom bar is a low participation neighbourhood marker. We can see that actually the number of students entering from the most disadvantaged backgrounds is up, but actually that gap between the most advantaged and least advantaged continues to spread. We're not closing that gap in between, and I think that's an important area to think about when we talk about widening participation. And the chart on the right is the Scottish equivalent, so the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, and we can see similar trends going on there as well. Next slide, please. And just to think about briefly the student experience at the moment and the impact that all these challenges, both for universities and in the wider environment around the cost of living crisis and kind of increased costs, are having on students. The report on the left is something we published right at the start of the cost of living crisis around real concerns that certain students are going to be most disadvantaged by the cost of living crisis. And the chart on the right is a more recent HEPI report, which looked at the amount of maintenance that students would need to just have an acceptable standard of living. And the maintenance support that students receive is well beyond that level at the moment. So there's concern around actually the maintenance support that's being given to students is only limited in terms of how much it can provide them with what's needed for their studies. Some can get support from parents, for example. Others are having to spend a lot of time doing lots of part-time work. Actually, there's a much greater proportion of students doing part-time work along their studies, and a much greater number of hours of that part-time work that's being done. So I think it's important to just remember the impact that then goes on to have in terms of the student experience. And next slide, please. Yeah, and just as I was saying, kind of thinking about what impact that might have, well, we could see an increase in students dropping out and leaving their studies. It also just could more generally kind of negatively impact the student experience and students' time in higher education, and could ultimately lead to students not choosing to enter higher education, and particularly when there's a buoyant job market. That's something that we sometimes see trends in that direction of. So kind of an important area, I think, for us all to be considering in terms of not just the impact for the university, but the impact for students themselves as well. So just to conclude, the final slide, please. I think we're starting to see some positive hints around HE policy focuses, or starting to see some hints around what they are. And it's likely that universities are going to have a role to play in kind of key priority areas for government in general. But financial sustainability is a key issue and going to be stay, I think, a key issue across all institutions, and I'm sure takes up a lot of time of governors thinking about kind of ways to respond to that. Of course, it's always important to remember that there's a risk that financial pressures impact on the student experience, and thinking about how we can mitigate and support students from that front. So I think although there's some sort of doom and gloom there around the challenges faced, I think actually there are some reasons for optimism in terms of the direction of travel, in terms of the kind of policy front, but it's important that universities make sure they have a key role to play as part of that. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
To think of someone to sort of say a little bit about kind of how governance generally works in institutions, I was really delighted that Claire was able to join us and say a little bit about that. So I've built you up very highly now, Claire. So you've got there's a bar to hit. So I'm going to hand over to you without further ado. Over to you, Claire. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So good morning, everyone. And Aaron, thank you very much for the warm welcome. I think you might have overinflated my ego and set your expectations a little bit too high, but I'll try my best to meet and exceed those expectations. It's honestly a genuine pleasure to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all. And before I dive in, I should just say, if anyone is looking to work with an organisation to review their governance effectiveness, I really do commend Advance HE. They're very knowledgeable and excellent. So, as Aaron has kindly introduced me, my name is Claire Hornsby. I'm Head of Corporate Governance at the University of Essex. I've been working in higher education since 2013, and I've been in my current post since 2016. So over the years, I've had the enormous privilege of supporting our governing body, which is known as Council, and a number of other key committees, so audit and risk management, nominations, policy and resources. So I've got quite a breadth of experience in terms of the governance at the university, but I've also had the opportunity to serve as our executive leadership meeting. So our university steering group meets once every fortnight for 4 hours each time. So I've been able to see the strategic and the operational. And in my capacity, I've been able to guide many governors and trustees through their induction and ongoing development, and as they engage with governance at the university. And in addition to my professional role, I've also served as a governor and trustee, but in a capacity of a multi-academy trust. And I have to admit, when I first took on the voluntary role, I assumed that my background in higher education governance would make for a smooth transition. And I quickly discovered that the learning curve was much steeper than expected. But I do think it's given me really valuable insights and a fresh perspective on governance and the nuances and being on the other side of the table, so to speak. So I hope this dual perspective will be valuable for you today. And I'm really looking forward to exploring some of the topics with you on the roles and responsibilities of governors. And I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So there will be opportunities for you to unmute yourselves or to contribute in the comments and that kind of stuff. So as much engagement as possible would be brilliant. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, before I forget. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect. So very quickly, throughout this session, I'm going to provide we're going to look at the role of the governor and trustee, the responsibilities, some challenges that you might experience, some tips on how to overcome these and to be really well prepared for your meetings, and some sector issues. I am conscious that you've already heard from Rachel this morning on higher education policy, and you're going to hear from Tom and Aaron later on around student experience and governance in the broader sense. So I'm going to try to not steal their thunder, and so keep it quite narrowly focused. That being said, HE governance, one of the possible definitions of that is around the system by which universities and other higher education institutions are directed and controlled. But that's as far as I'm going to go with that. So this is your opportunity to chime in. Can I, by show of reactions, is anyone absolutely new to being a governor and a trustee in every sense, in every different context? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're brand new? I can see 2 thumbs up. Oh, 3, 4, so a couple. Has anyone got some experience, but from a different sector? And has anyone got lots of experience but is just new to their institution? We've got a mix really of different levels of experience, and thank you so much for sharing. But based on your varying levels of experience, you're probably going to be coming to this with different challenges and opportunities in your role as a governor and trustee. And it's not just about being able to make a valuable contribution to a new institution or organisation, but there are also really good development opportunities for yourself. And that's really, and quite selfishly, how I got into becoming a governor and trustee. I wanted to make myself much more attractive to employers, to my current employer, and I did want to give back, but I wanted to demonstrate I could operate in that really strategic way. And later on, I'll tell you how that became a problem for me. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity not just to explore some of these issues, but today will be a really great opportunity for you to expand on or to build your higher education network of governors and trustees as well, which can be really important. So in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, what do you think is the most important role of a governor, or some of the most important roles of a governor? So, Brandon, so to ensure the university exists after we're gone, that's a really good one. To provide oversight, seek assurance and support the leadership team. To develop strategy for growth. Oh, you can't hear me, David. To support the development of strategy. Is that better, David? I'll try and speak as clearly as possible. Custodian of strategy for long-term viability existence. Oversight, not management. That's a really important one, Leighton, and I have a slide on that. Holding the Vice Chancellors to account. Manage risks and remuneration. Financial sustainability. So they're really, really good suggestions that you've come up with. So some of the things that I've had responded to previously is around financial sustainability, managing academic quality. That mustn't be mistaken for not respecting the role of the Senate or the academic board. But there is an element of receiving assurance on academic quality. So upholding regulatory and legal compliance, promoting inclusivity and diversity, safeguarding student welfare experience, holding the executive to account, providing strategic leadership. So these are some of the things that you guys have said, but also colleagues at previous sessions have also said. So obviously there are multiple facets to the role from the answers that you've given and the answers that we've received previously. And many of these are closely interlinked. So each responsibility contributes to the overall success and sustainability of an institution. And the priorities for each institution will be different depending on their context. So I'm not going to say for each institution that what we would describe as the statement of primary responsibilities will be exactly the same, but there will be commonalities across them. And although that slide talks about student welfare and experience, there are specific obligations that a university has to its students' union, and Aaron, I'm sure, will be an expert in that, given his experience and his background. So for me, I've put up a picture of a rowing boat. And I would say for a governor and a trustee, you are the coxswain of the rowing team. So both roles require oversight, clear communication, and the ability to guide others to a shared role. The coxswain doesn't row the boat, but they're responsible for steering in the right direction, making real-time decisions, ensuring the team is aligned and working efficiently together. Similarly, a governor doesn't manage the day-to-day operations of an institution, but instead it provides that strategic leadership, ensuring the institution stays on course with its mission and long-term objectives. And sometimes it might be necessary to say, actually, that really was the right decision at the right time, but the context has changed so greatly that we need to look again at the strategy and the way forward. But that's not something that you would do, you know, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. That's not just an on the off the hoof kind of decision that you would make. It needs some real thinking. Like the coxswain, governors have to be calm under pressure, making critical strategic decisions, and decide what are the best ways to achieve results, but also thinking about key performance indicators. The relevance and value of a key performance indicator can change over time. One example might be which league table you use to measure your success. In one instance, you might choose one. There could be reasons that you might wish to choose a separate league table to monitor your success. But there are, of course, a whole host of debates and conversations that you might have around league tables and their value anyway. A governor needs to maintain a level head, particularly when it's faced with challenges and external pressures. I'm going to talk about some of those later on, but for an institution like Essex, we are so diverse. We had lots of students from the European Union. So when Brexit hit and the changes came in, that was a huge challenge. I think it was around 75% of our EU students was just gone. And how do you, as a governor, make sure that the institution is taking the preparatory action to withstand the impact of that and also bounce back? So these are different things that you need to be thinking about. How do you hold the executive to account and support them to ensure the institution's success? It's about being a critical friend. You need to have a close relationship with them. You shouldn't be in bed with them. There needs to be that challenge, that robust challenge. And just as the coxswain helps their team perform at its best, as governors, you're the stewards of your institution. So ensuring that it can stay on course and thrive and evolve as the education landscape does. One of my favourite illustrations is actually an advanced HE illustration, which shows you the difference between governance and management. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on. One of the things particularly new and less experienced governors can tend to get drawn into is the management side, wanting to be more involved in the day-to-day, and actually you need to take a step back. For me, as a governance professional, I found I was more getting bogged down in the fact that papers weren't presented in the way that I liked, that they weren't of high enough quality, that they didn't match with my expectations. And now I found that a huge distraction. I had to change my mindset from being a governance professional to being that strategic leader, to being a governor and a trustee of a multi-academy trust. And it's a learning curve, and it's trying not to get distracted. So making sure that you are setting the mission and strategic direction of the organisation, have effective management systems in place. You're not there to decide which management system or which management process, just to receive assurance that they are effective. You need to be monitoring performance and approving the annual budget, and ensuring that you've got effective monitoring systems and control and accountability and compliance with the legislative responsibilities. You're not responsible for demonstrating the compliance, that's the executive. So I will share these slides with you afterwards, or Patrick will. So that's one I keep coming back to in all of the governor inductions that I do, especially for new governors and trustees who are on that journey, that learning journey. I mentioned earlier that the committee, that they have a statement of primary responsibilities that's been produced by the Committee of University Chairs, and the CUC also produces the Governor Code of Conduct. So if you've not had an opportunity to read through that document, it's definitely worthwhile as a new governor or trustee. And again, the primary statement of responsibilities, they really can be synthesised to talk about the things that you mentioned in the chat and that I've picked up on previous slides. So I won't go through these, but they're available for you later on. One of the biggest things is around challenges, and so I'd really love to hear from you as to what challenges you have experienced, if you're an experienced governor, or what things might be concerning you. And I want to say this is an absolutely safe space. It's not going anywhere else. One of the things I found most helpful, actually, one of the things I found most helpful and easy to integrate into the board that I joined was being vulnerable, saying, actually, this is quite an uncomfortable learning journey for me. I'm going to ask basic questions, and being vulnerable isn't for everyone. Some people might feel it might undermine their credibility, but actually for me, it was a source of strength, and it helped the organisation that I was being a governor for to think about the way in which they communicated in their governance papers. It turned out I wasn't the only person who didn't understand. I was just the only one who was brave enough to say it. And it also helped the board challenge its thinking and assumptions on issues that it was really familiar with, where perhaps it had created this blind spot because they knew it inside out. And actually, as someone coming in from the outside, I was able to say, but why? Is that really aligned with the strategy? And ask those other questions. So, are there any challenges that you've experienced, or are there any challenges that you're anticipating? You'll be capacity constrained, but you're bringing functional skills and expertise, and these are the bits that the institution is desperate for you to know, because it's going to aid you in your institutional sector knowledge, but also there might be compliance issues that they need to be able to demonstrate compliance with. Reflect on your experience and contributions. So I always recommend keeping a journal, reflecting on the how the meeting went, what you were able to contribute. Reflect on things that you didn't know, so you can identify new areas for training and development. And actually reading back on prior journal entries is so helpful in your own voice is showing you how you've developed over time. But speaking with your board mentor or getting feedback from the chair and other board members is really helpful in saying, how have you contributed? What other ways? How could they support you on that learning journey? And the secretary as well. Attend external network and training sessions. So again, Advance HE do a huge range of different sessions where you can network and also gain a broader perspective and hear from a range of different voices. And visit the campuses if you can. There's nothing like being on campus where you see the students, you see the facilities that they're able to engage with. Before, during and after the meeting, make sure you've read the papers, go in prepared. It will give you more confidence. It will help you to understand where those questions are. Be inquisitive and provide constructive challenge. The diversity of a board means that you're going to have people with different perspectives and experiences. So it's likely that at some point there will be disagreements, but being able to disagree agreeably is so important. I've already mentioned about reflecting on your participation and contribution, and providing constructive feedback on the performance of the board is also important. Building relationships, this has been a theme that's come out throughout this session. So find a buddy who can act as a mentor, spend time getting to know your fellow trustees, develop your higher education board network. So important. They will post things on LinkedIn or be able to share experiences. Be mindful of maintaining confidentiality where it's appropriate and necessary, but do reach out to others and meet your governance team. They might not be specialists in a particular subject, but they are governance specialists. They have been through the mill. They understand different ways that we might be able to support you in training or engagement. And then keep up to date with sector news, email briefings and newsletters, online and print media. Things, you know, we might be thinking, if I take the example of the devastating war in Ukraine, actually, that might seem a really far away thing to your institution, but the impact is soon felt in terms of logistics, students, all those different things. So think about horizon scanning. And very quickly, I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges that you might experience in the role, which are affecting the sector. And some of these things will have come up already from Rachel's discussion, and they might come up later on. But a number of institutions are still recovering from Brexit and COVID-19. In different ways. So that might be something that you might be coming across. The cost of living crisis affecting staff and students. It's affecting students' perceptions whether they can afford to go to university. So how might the university support them through accommodation? And also recognising that you might have had students who were coming to live in your on-campus accommodation, if you offer that, who are now going to stay at home and commute. So how might that affect not just their experience, but your income, which will then affect the other services that you can provide? Industrial action, there is a test case, I would say, going on at the moment. So the impact of industrial action and COVID-19 and the expectations versus the reality of the learning experience. That's something to watch out for over the next 2 to 5 years, see how that falls out. Mental health and well-being, not just of your students, but of your staff as well. Optimising the size and shape of the institution. As we see trends in subject popularity change, how are you going to make sure that your departments and institution as a whole is sustainable and washing their own face? And a piece of work that we did with Advanced HE is how do we optimise the size and shape of our governing body? Really important. We went from 25 to 19 members to make sure that there was opportunity and space for everybody to contribute in a meaningful way. As I just joined the last session, there was discussions around visas, surcharges, the impact on international recruitment. I think the sector has seen huge differences in the PG recruitment, lots of different kinds of activities, different institutions engaging in clearing this year, which we might not have expected to engage in previously, to offset shortfalls against their minimum entry targets. Huge competition for research and the complex regulatory environment. I think one of the things we might expect to see is the Office for Students' relationship with institutions evolve now that we have a new government. The relationship that the OFS had with the sector versus its predecessor, HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, not directly comparable, but broadly similar institutions, changed significantly. So how might that change over time? And how does the Office for Student respond to the potential crisis in funding and financial sustainability of the sector? Environmental sustainability, you need to have funding available to ensure that you're meeting your environmental targets and the legislation around that. Academic freedom and freedom of speech within the law, a huge issue which is going to continue, I think. But we have seen a pause, at least, on the legislation, and so we need to see how the Labour government's going to respond to that. And I've touched on the relationship with the sector regulator. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of some of the issues and the challenges, and I hope it's been helpful.
I'm going to hand over to our next speaker in just a second, but just to sort of perhaps explain a little of the logic of today. We've deliberately tried to start very big picture with kind of what's going on at the sector as a whole, say a little bit about kind of the sorts of things that you might expect in terms of the governance arrangements within your institution. But I do hear regularly from governors that getting your head around the sort of the experiences of students, the sort of student experience, academic oversight, tends to be one of the key reasons why people put themselves forward to be a governor. It's because you care about the delivery of education, want it to be something that your institution does as well as it can do. But I also hear alongside that sometimes, to the surprise of governors, the extent to which academic and student issues are covered feels somewhat kind of compressed or maybe not given as much attention as you might anticipate. And I think for those of you, as you go through your first year and a bit, and getting a sense of how well you discuss and hear about the student experience will be something I think you'll want to kind of reflect on. But we deliberately wanted us, therefore, as part of this day, to try and kind of sort of turbocharge your thinking and your insights around this topic. And so I'm really pleased that we're able to be joined by Tom Lowe, and Tom will say a little bit about his role, but he's kind of one of the sort of foremost thinkers and doers and I suppose researchers around student experience and student partnership. He's written extensively, spoken extensively about this. So I was really delighted he was able to say a little bit about understanding the experiences of students. And so on that note, I'll hand over to you, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Aaron, thank you so much. And I'll just start my timer because I know it's going to take. Colleagues, it's wonderful to be here today. I've come to you talking as someone right in the middle of higher education, where I've recently taken a role at the University of Westminster as an assistant head of school for student experience. Westminster is right in the heart of London, and the majority of our students are Londoners and commuters, and many of whom are what the university sector would be described as widening participation, so from some form of disadvantaged background. I have, as Aaron has highlighted, been in the space of student engagement for well over 10 years now, starting off my time actually in student unions as well. So a shout out for anyone who's a student officer on the call today. I'm going to share with you some perspectives and some considerations for what it's like to be a student today. Most of you on the call were a student yourself. You might have been a student last year, you might have been a student last decade, or you might have been a student last century. Considering what it's like to be a student today is quite different. There are similarities, and I hope this talk today shares just some of the perspectives and some of the research from our wider sector. So I'm going to start off with the context, and many of this you'll have heard this morning. These images on screen is what I always show to people when I talk about student engagement experience in higher education. And I start off by saying, actually, this is a tough gig. The UK higher education sector has previously been labelled as quite an easy sector to work in, armchair academics and things like that. But actually our sector is quite fraught. There's lots of challenges externally and internally. And the journey that our students have been on, our society's been on, and our university have been on, make actually the context of higher education a very challenging one. And of course, as part of that context is our students. So how do we try and understand the student experience in higher education? Well, you may have heard already of all these metrics on screen. These are all different quantitative measures we have of whether students are successful or not about their experience. Some of these report to the Office for Students, our sector regulator, and some of these actually report to things like university league tables. You'll probably spend a lot of your time talking about the ones in yellow on screen here. These all involve students, whether it's them staying on, dropping out, completing, being happy, going on to graduate level employment, or the money we spend on students. You'll be bombarded with a lot of data as governors, but I'm going to argue that it's also important to listen to students' stories and students' voices when we trying to work out how we can make our universities the very best they can. Student voice is actually something that the UK is really well known for across the world. And actually, it's a Europe-wide practice of engaging students in quality assurance. Now, that sounds very formal. As a governor, you'll probably see students engaging quality assurance as the student president on your board. But student voice, or speaking to students about their education, is as simple as a conversation. And I would really encourage governors to find opportunities to just have some conversations with some students on the ground. And that can be in campus cafes, that can be working with the OSU to find those opportunities, are all really wonderful opportunities just to understand and increase our empathy. I refer to it as topping up our empathy to understand what it's like to be a student today. Now, there's other sources as well. It can be email, and email is a big source of students, student representatives, the surveys, of course. It's also complaints, colleagues, too. And I would encourage you as a governor to ask your university what's going on with complaints. For those of you who've been in other sectors, complaints are sometimes the most important source of feedback we can get. And then, of course, working with your student union. I really advocate that we need to talk to the people who live it. We often hear on committees, someone will say, well, when I was a student, it was like this, so let's do it that way. Now, that's, of course, very useful, and we all want to reminisce about when we were a student. However, I would make the argument now, if you weren't a student during the pandemic or since, your view probably is a bit dated. So even if you were a student in 2017, you probably don't know what it's like to be a student today. So let's return to a context. I want to deep dive using the image on the far left as a bit of a vehicle to talk about student experience today. And that is the image of the empty classroom, something that's really worrying colleagues. Universities aren't necessarily going public about this, about their attendance on site, because it can be quite embarrassing, can be quite concerning. But we know across the sector that less students are choosing to come to campus. And this would just be a little vehicle for the next 4 minutes to show how interesting and how difficult it is for students of today. So why are students attending campus less? Why are they engaging with our wonderful spaces that we spend millions of pounds on creating and saying this is going to create our sticky campus, it's going to be really attractive for our students? Well, the pandemic taught us a lot. We were all there, we all lived through it. We engaged with society differently. We engaged with our friends differently, shopping differently, the NHS, our banks differently. Everything became a bit more online and a bit more at distance. And of course, our learners of today, if they're traditionally aged, they were part of the pandemic in prior education levels. And I think the impact of the pandemic isn't something we should forget. it has changed how we engage with elements in wider society. And I've done some research recently at 3 post-92 universities where we've asked students those questions. And these slides will be shared afterwards, colleagues, where we've asked students, why aren't you attending class as much? And the quotes on screen highlight, well, students saying such things as, well, we didn't really need to attend in secondary school and still passed. So we kind of know that we don't really need to attend university and still pass the same. We showed a whole generation of learners that you don't necessarily need to be in the room to still learn. You can learn remotely, you can learn online. So a lot of students have experienced distance learning and realized the potential of that. There's been lots of sector studies about attendance and students attending campus. This isn't just something going on at your university, going on in the UK, it's going on all over the world, but particularly in contexts where student finances are low, where students are having to work to support their studies, or where maybe there's not a lot of financial support through grants for students, so they can maybe attend campus 9 to 5. The different studies on screen highlight not just how lower footfall has been seen across the world, but also how actually perhaps students are a lot more financially less well off. I point you particularly the final 3 points on screen. About 49% of students missing lectures to do work, 1 in 5 students considering dropping out because of the cost of living crisis, and then part-time student work increasing from 13.5 hours a week to 23 hours a week. The cost of living crisis, I hope we all know, is a true thing. For some of us on the call, it might just make our food shop more expensive, our holiday more expensive, our car insurance more expensive. But to our students, it's quite grim. The maintenance loan in 23-24 only went up 2%, and we know that inflation at its highest was 11 to 14%. The numbers on screen were highlighted from this Russell Group students report of 8,800 students, highlighting just how stark things are for students. And if you're at a widening participation university like my own, these numbers will be even harsher, actually. Our students in our studies have highlighted the same thing, referring to it as the new pandemic of the cost of living. There is lots of 0 hours work available, warehouse work, catering work, services work, but a lot of these are 0 hours contract. The work's quite precarious, and often it can be at night time. And I spoke to a student in our study saying, well, I work in a nightclub till 5 a.m. every night. How can you expect me to go to the 9 a.m. class 4 hours later? And it really is quite stark for a lot of students. A lot of student unions in 2022 talked to running food banks on campus, and they found they were engaged with international students, but actually the majority of students are just working their way through the cost of living crisis. There also are some things that we're doing. I've talked about the pandemic, I've talked about COVID, but there are lots of reasons why students are choosing to attend campus less. This list from Jim Dickinson at Wonky is very good, actually. It highlights lots of different reasons why students might not be attending, and sometimes lecturers can think, well, these are loads of reasons. Well, how can I do anything about that? But the ones in yellow, I think staff on the ground can do something about it. We can ensure our courses don't cross-compete. We can ensure we have good teaching. We can ensure that our timetabling works for students. But also there's wider issues on screen we can do something about. I think it's Peterborough University that's looking at doing travel bursaries to campus. My own university, Westminster, is doing free breakfast on campus every day, and all our meals cost no more than £3 at lunch. Universities are looking at what they can do, the block teaching model as well, and there's lots of ideas out there for what we can do. But one of the best questions I ask in our research is, why do you attend some classes and not others? And they say, well, I attend Aaron's classes because Aaron's very interesting. He has lots of anecdotes, stories. I really see the value in giving my time. But I don't attend Tom's classes because Tom reads from the slides, and I can read from the slides at home. Thank you very much. There's also things going on around the generation that we're engaging. So the majority of our students are Generation Z. That means they were born in 1996 onwards. This generation grew up with Google. They grew up, YouTube came out in 2006. There is very much a view, and we're like this too, everybody, that if we have any question in the world, we just go to our smartphone. If we have any want to fix something, do a bit of DIY, we go to YouTube. And it's the same for our students. When I was a student, I had to go to the library or the class to gain knowledge, whereas now we get everything as quickly as possible. And things like Netflix have increased that as well. Where at Winchester in 2020, 2022, in our conversations with students, we're hearing about students box setting their degrees. So not attending any classes for 10 weeks, then watching 10 classes by video catch-up in one weekend. The way we are engaging with each other and wider society is changing. I talked about the way we engage with friends, with banking, with the health services, with shopping, with takeaways, with going to the cinema. All of these things are moving more and more remote. And I think we make choices now as people, as we become highly productive in a fast-paced environment. But how can we do things faster? How can we do things cheaper? And how can we do things more convenient? And our students are making these choices every day, just like we are with the workplace. And I think we talk about data access a lot as universities, but perhaps we should be talking about knowledge access. So how are students accessing the knowledge? And certainly my last university, Portsmouth, we're playing with lots of micro content, so short, snappy content to engage in students. Now, of course, when you scratch the surface, you will meet lazy students or students who say, I'm just in bed too much. They are out there, of course. It's easy to jump to those conclusions first, and I guarantee you the majority of cases that's not the case. But you will need to know that we do have to reach out at universities through personal tutoring or mentoring or student support services to help people re-engage who have fallen into those patterns too. So I think for the last 3 minutes or so, I want to talk about the students who come on to our universities. So in England, but actually I think the wider UK, university is still the occupation of choice for 18-year-olds. It's still the top thing 18-year-olds choose to do over any other industry. And what's interesting is they're still coming. There's been 23 years of tuition fees, 10 years of 9K fees, 7 years of value for money rhetoric. People are still coming, and they expect the time of their life, perhaps, that's what society tells them, and some form of graduate job. But we're now engaging students in a very different way to how when we were at university, even 10 years ago. We're engaging students online through distance learning, block teaching, commuters. More students are choosing to commute in a higher variety of student backgrounds and pathways. A lot of what we do is still designed around the traditional student experience, and maybe we're leaving some students who fit outside that traditional student either identity or demographic or pathway, and they start feeling barriers to belonging and becoming a full student. I will talk about belonging for a second in a moment, but it's important, colleagues, that we look for the opposite of belonging too. The opposite of belonging for me is alienation. Alienation is like passing into a new environment where you don't understand anything. And Sarah Mann in 2001 talked about going to universities like passing into a different country. They're full of different languages, structures, robes, acronyms, and they can be very alienating for students whose parents didn't go to university. And it's the majority of students at Westminster. I think to overcome this, we have to focus on belonging and revisit some of those traditional things universities were known for, like the rich engagements highlighted on screen, the benefit of making friends at university, sports teams, societies, student unions, part-time work, trips. I'm very big on trips in my role at the moment. That can be as short as a day trip to a free museum, which I'm taking some students on this week, or that can be in international excursions as well. But if the promise of higher education is you'll have the time of your life, we need to make sure it's a bit more personal, actually. The temptation is to put everything online, make everything super fast to engage with, but then we sometimes lose that person. We did research at Winchester in 2016 on belonging, and we asked students, when did you get a sense of belonging? And they said, well, actually, we gained belonging all across their journey, from open days to getting help from the reception desks, from our first class, from our one-to-ones with our support tutors, through joining sports and societies. What was quite interesting is the whole university has an impact on belonging. But I tell you what, the whole university can also do the opposite, which is make students feel alienated. The study from Banger on screen just highlights all the different ways students can belong. And there's lots of different ways on screen where students can have a sense of belonging from their time. So to wrap up, I'll just show an image on screen, really. I think students' lives are quite chaotic, and they've got a lot to deal with. And sometimes we give students a bashing and say, well, they're not engaging or they're not involved in my thing that I'm trying to run and engage students in. But students are meant to keep on touch of their course, their faculty, and the free modules they're studying. That's already a lot of, let's say, emails coming into their inbox. They're also trying to engage with the SU, the library, student services, the careers services, student union, the university all-campus announcements, student voice group work, social medias, and then everything else. I think we're often wrestling for students' attention. And of course, that's quite shattering. It's quite hard to break through in. And I think having a good conversation with students can be really worthwhile. We mapped the student journey at Winchester, and I would value any time to do this in your own context. Quite easy when you map just student voice at a university. It looks very simple. But then you add students' assessment into there, and you think, oh, crikey, it's quite a busy screen. And if you consider everything I had on the screen there, we mapped a full student journey, and it looks like this. We put our students through quite a lot in higher education, and we're asking them to navigate these very complex organizations that we are too. So to round off, I would just say universities are about people, and we need to have discussions about how they're finding these organizations that are going through an immense amount of change, of digitization, stretched finance and fundings, and perhaps trying to reach back to our perfect university. I would say there's no going back to the old normal, and really we must anticipate change going forward. And if we want to achieve student belonging and success, we've got to be empathetic to our students. The cost of living crisis doesn't seem to be going away, so we've got to recognise students are as financially stretched as ever. So therefore, of course, we need to focus on our student experiences to make the universities the best we can. So that brings me to an end, colleagues. I will share my slides with you, and my email address is on screen too. And Aaron, I'm happy to take a question or two if we've got time.
I'm going to move us straight on to a next session, which is going to build on a little bit of what we've covered previously. So hopefully colleagues can see my slide. So I just wanted to say a little bit more about the governance environment in higher education. And I think we've tried to convey, both through this session, and I'm sure you'll have picked up just in reading about universities in the press and through your local inductions, that the environment that I'm going to use universities as a shorthand for higher education institutions, it's a much more complex environment. And therefore, I think the role of the board becomes more important in a more volatile environment. It was only 7 or 8 years ago that the number of students that a university could recruit, domestic students a university could recruit, was largely set for it by government through an arm's length body. There was a student number control. And so if you got 1,000 students last year, you might have got 1,050 the next year, but there was never very dramatic changes year to year. That student number control was removed, and we see much fiercer competition. That's one example of how the policy environment is more changing year to year, and therefore making clear strategic plans for how you want to change the shape of your institution, what mix of students you want, what level of study and so on has become quite a bit more prominent. And it's only a relatively recent change. If you think of the history of universities, some of them have been around, well, a couple of them for 800 years, many of them for 100, 150 years, something quite significant only being 7 or 8 years in its introduction is relatively recent. And I think because of that, how the board balances its time between sort of in-year monitoring, this year's student recruitment, this year's league table performance, this year's finances, this year's kind of building project update, versus where does the institution need and want to be over 5, 10 years from now, is quite a delicate balancing act, made complicated further by the regulatory burden that undoubtedly exists on universities. There's quite a lot of reporting that we have to make to the Office for Students in England or to the regulators in Wales and Scotland, respectively. And that can feel like it dominates quite a lot of the board meeting bandwidth. And so there are difficult and delicate questions to decide about what to bring to the board and when is the right time to bring it. Is it a very general discussion or is it something for sign-off? And when I go in and sit in on university board meetings, either as part of a kind of an effectiveness review, or if I think about the university board I chair, I'm trying to get the balance or think about the balance of what is brought to the board and when is it brought to the board? What sort of discussion is it? And sometimes there can be a temptation to bring lots of things for sign off and note from the board, which feels like a bit of a fait accompli, where really the board are kind of expected to agree with what the executive have done some work on. And there's obviously a time and place for that. But on the big strategic choices that the institution needs to decide, a new campus or breaching into a new discipline area, or moving into a significant international territory in a big way or a big partnership. These are the sorts of discussions I would expect the university board to agree and to have been involved in the thinking about, but that isn't always how things play out. Similarly, the balance between good news and bad news. And also, for the vast majority of you, being a university governor is a voluntary endeavour. There are a small number of chairs who are paid, but for the most part, 99% of university governors are doing so voluntarily. I think there are some natural limits on time and the best and most efficient way to get our inputs. And so that needs to be incorporated in the governance as well. I mentioned we'll circulate the slides, and I'm not going to go through all of these, and I'm also aware of what's coming next, and I think some of these things will be touched on. But there's been some regular reference to the balance between governance and management and trying to make sure we occupy the right oversight space rather than the kind of the doing and the implementation. Being clear about what your responsibilities are and how that is conveyed to you in induction, becoming familiar with the regulatory requirements that are on the heads of institutions and specifically sit with the board, trying to get that right balance between kind of constructive challenge and support, becoming familiar with the institutional strategy. So again, sort of the strategy of the institution has been referred to a few times today. Becoming familiar with that is really important. And it may be that you're walking into quite a well-established strategy. Some of these documents and aims are, 10, 15-year timeframes, and you might have come into one that was agreed 5 or 6 years ago, and it might be kind of well known by the board, but you're still getting to grips with it. Equally, you might be joining an institution that's at the very beginnings of having a conversation about what its next 10 years might look like. It's a different sort of experience being on the board when you're in the development of a strategy phase versus implementation and delivery. And even if you're mid-delivery on a strategy, the world has had some seismic shocks in the last 5 years, certainly, whether that's kind of COVID or, international relations more generally. And that has, for most institutions, had an impact on some of the ambitions that we had. We heard earlier about the changing way in which students are engaging with teaching, partly as a consequence and as a legacy of COVID. For other institutions, there were grand ambitions about international growth, which a combination of diplomatic tension and a change in government policy under the last government and a non-reversal of that under this new government, even if the rhetoric is slightly warmer. These have had profound implications on the extent to which institutions have been able to realise those international ambitions. So you'll be wanting to think about what a good board looks like, and whether you're new to HE boards or whether you're quite an experienced executive or non-executive on boards, you'll have your conceptions about what a good board looks like. And this slide obviously refers to some of the things that I think you'd expect to see: a board that asks the right questions, that sees itself constructively, but also challenging the executive and getting the right balance on those things, has good financial and strategic judgment, unambiguously puts the institution first, irrespective of how we find ourselves on the board, whether we're the student union president or a member of staff who's a governor or an independent governor. Our overall and uniting ambition is to think about the long-term health of the institution as a whole. And sometimes that can involve having to take some difficult short-term decisions to preserve the long-term health of the institution. And when required, kind of pulling together in adversity, I think, is a feature of a good board rather than, pointing the finger of blame. Conversely, some of the things that can disrupt or derail a good board is not seeing itself as a team, but rather as a series of individuals, being captured by the executive. And there are instances of where that has happened, where the board are perhaps not provided with the right information or culturally don't challenge the executive in the right way to feel uncomfortable or incapable of doing so. Also, on the flip side of that, there have been instances when boards have become too adversarial with their executive, feeling like they're marking the homework too dramatically of every decision that's brought to them. And so getting the right balance there, clearly important. Having some kind of ground rules about how you want to operate as a board and having an open discussion as a board. And that may be the sort of thing that you can do as an away day, actually passing over some time for a discussion about how the board operates. You know, what works well on the board, what doesn't work so well on the board. Maybe that we feel too pressured to get through the business. Maybe there isn't enough time to have a discussion. Maybe we think that you're too, you know, just noting and signing everything off and not having enough discussions, or having too many discussions and then not seeing what happens with the actions. As you acclimatise with your local university board, you know, you'll get a sense of what it is you think you do well and what you do less well. But something that comes up commonly is this question of volume of information. You know, the board packs for universities tend to often be 200, 300, 400 pages. And I think the use of the cover sheets is highly inconsistent. Some universities deploy them very well, draw out the key features, you know, proper executive summaries, and point you clearly to the actions and input from the board. Others don't really curate that information particularly expertly, and you're left to sort of wade through, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of pages. And I think, you know, seeing the wood from the trees, what's important and what's not so important, is a difficult thing to do, even for an experienced governor, you know, 300 or 400 pages when you've got to consider. This slide's going to be touched on by our next speaker, and this was also covered by Claire, so I'm not going to rehearse this. And this slide also kind of talks to this general question of getting the information at the right time. So I'm going to leave you with some practical tips that I'm not going to read out, but just alert you to the fact that these will be in the slides that come round. They're taken from that guide that I referred to earlier, which I pulled together for Advanced HE, which is, you know, a guidance document. You know, it's only about 8 pages for new governors, and it might kind of help you to kind of work out some of the things that you might want to usefully do as you settle into your role. But there's, you know, 16 or so different things, some of it about practical things you can do, some of it about relationships, and some of it about systems and processes. For those of you that are also interested, you might want to learn about some instances where HE sector governance has come into the spotlight. Sometimes it's because it's been seen as a kind of bit of a governance failure. There have been some governance issues in HE, and these are 5 different universities who I think have had challenging governance circumstances over the last decade, but they have often learnt some good lessons from them. And I think one of the good things about universities is they often then are quite good at sharing those lessons with other institutions. So I'm not going to go into the individual circumstances of these 5 governance issues at universities. They are publicly documented, but the reviews and the reports into some of those are also publicly available. And in fact, Kim and I helped to undertake the review at De Montfort after some issues that they had, which was more a kind of culture issue at De Montfort, which existed about 5 years or so ago. And if you're interested, there's some data on the kind of makeup of governing bodies. Unfortunately, this data is only analysed every 2 years, and there's the new data is coming out in December. So we're sort of, you know, we're 22 months into a 24-month cycle here. So the data feels a little bit out of date, but it will be updated in December. I've had a quick sneak preview of the upcoming data, and there's been a little bit of further progress, but only very marginally on gender and age. There's been a bit more progress on ethnicity amongst the governors in UK higher education, although we understand that most of that has actually been driven by student governor demography being more mixed than independent governors. And if you're really interested, there's a breakdown on the size and shape of university governing bodies by institutional type and history. So the ancients are sort of Oxford and Cambridge, the earlies, you can work out the other categories, I think, reasonably easily from there. But the average size of an English university governing body is just under 19, 18.7, of which there's an independent majority of 12 and an internal composition of around 6, but it varies on how that 6 is populated. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of extra kind of sight into some of the kind of governance features of higher education, and we'll send those slides around subsequently. Now, to finish things off, I mentioned at the start of the day, we're going to hear from 2 more experienced governors who have also had or held or hold executive roles in higher education. So Alison Alden has been a governor at a range of different institutions, at Regents, at Northumbria. She's had board roles outside of higher education as well, and she was for a number of years the chief executive of the statistics agency for the sector that compiled actually some of the data I just referred to. And Kim Ansell works at Advanced HE. She's been a board member at the University of West London, and she's also had some board experience from outside of HE. I'm going to hand over to each of them to say a few words about their experience of being a governor and some pointers for you as new ones, and then we'll finish off if there's any time at the end for some comments and questions. So I'm going to hand over.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. Very much appreciated. And thanks, Patrick, for sharing the slides so promptly. We'll move straight on and I'll introduce myself. As Aaron said, I work at Advanced HE and I've been a board member at the University of West London, which also included being on committees, Audit and Risk Committee and on the Workforce Committee. I've recently stood down to complete my ESG diploma with the Corporate Governance Institute, which I might not have time to talk about today, but I'm very happy to talk to anyone who wants to talk about it at another time. Very passionate about that sort of thing. And previously, I've had some experience in professional bodies, organisations like Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, ACCA, the Certified Chartered Accountants, CIPD, professional examining bodies, and their committees and councils, and secretaries to some of their committees and the general charitable trust in those professional bodies. So I've been on both sides of the fence, both the governance professional and the governor side of the fence. So there's three things from a governor perspective and through a governor lens that I want to focus on today very briefly, and particularly to think about them through the governance lens, even though they'll be building on things that Aaron, Claire and Tom have all spoken about. So the three things are sense making, the balance that we need to achieve as governors, and the importance of remembering the outside world and that horizon scanning piece, lifting our gaze beyond the institution and thinking more broadly. Next slide, please, Patrick. So sense making to start off with. Well, there's two things I think about as a governor when I'm trying to make sense of a new institution. The first is, what tools do I have to guide me? And the second is, what are my opportunities to engage with that institution? And the sense making bit's really important, because once you start to think about that, you can then start to understand the culture, not just of the organisation, but of the governing body as well. And quite often we go to a new organisation and we see the charts, we see the process, we see the structure, the formal documentation, as it were. But when we look behind, we sense, we feel, we hear, the two things don't match up. And so it's really important to spend some time doing that. Aaron's spoken about the strategy, the strategic plan. You'll need to look at your codes of practice, your governance code, your ethics code, and particularly if you sign up to the CUC code, whether you comply or don't comply with all the aspects of that code, so that you understand the governing body and your role. Roles and responsibilities can also come from the primary statements, which Claire mentioned, from the committee terms of reference. Communication protocols are really important. How is the university communicating to you? How is it communicating to all its stakeholders about governance in the institution? So sense making, using all that documentation, bringing it together, and then making a decision for yourself about whether what you're seeing in those tools and in those guidance documents fits with what you're hearing and what you're feeling. And if it's not, having to make the time to either speak to someone or look a little bit deeper in some way to marry those two things up. And the second thing is opportunities to engage. And it's great that you're all here, because that means that the institution that you are a governor for is investing in you as a governor. And it's really important that this is an ongoing process, not just a one-off, not just your first 3 months, but an ongoing opportunity for you to understand the sector, understand the institution, understand your role as a governor and whether that's changing. So do please continue to think about your development as a governor in your particular institution. But opportunities to engage with students, as Tom mentioned, really important, and the Students' Union. I was really lucky at the University of West London. There was a fantastic partnership between the governing body, the Student Union, and the executive team. And that three-way partnership worked really, really well. So look for that and look at opportunities to engage with the Student Union if it's not already existing. And then the events and activities that the university puts on, either specifically for governors or for others. Sometimes universities have open public programs. Sometimes if there's a drama department, there's performances, all sorts of ways to engage with the university, understand about the culture of the university and the students. So sense making for me is the first and foremost thing about being a governor. Next slide, please, Patrick. Aaron touched on a little bit of this, and I'd just like to frame it in a slightly different way. When we do a governance effectiveness review at Advanced HE, we think about the enablers of good governance. So those things that support governance, like the paperwork, like the planning of meetings, like the board diversity to ensure that there's a range of opinions and ideas coming through the board. We talk about behaviours and cultures. So is the challenge right? And Aaron referred to that. And what does the culture feel like to enable everybody to contribute their best and play a part in their role as a governor? And then we talk about added value. So we think about how each governor as an individual and then the governing body as a collective is adding value to the institution in the role that they're playing. And that can be understood through doing board surveys, through evaluation of each board member. So is your chair having a meeting with you once a year to ask if you feel you're contributing, how you might be able to contribute more? And so getting that balance right for yourself and assuring yourself that all these things under those three headings have the right balance is really important. And I heard somebody ask the question earlier, if I don't think the focus is right, what might I do? And absolutely, the university secretary would be my first port of call. So, you know, I think, university secretary, that we're spending a lot of time on regulatory stuff and we're not really doing the deep dive stuff. And it might be that you're very new and in the cycle of business, it hasn't come to that deep dive strategic thinking piece throughout the year. So talk to them about the forward agenda, where that happens, and asking those questions and asking powerful questions around the balance and understanding that balance and whether you think it's right and finding ways to challenge that is really important. Next slide, please, Patrick. And so to horizon scanning, lifting our gaze beyond the institution. And also, as a new governor, it's tempting to be swayed by groupthink, those around the room that are more experienced than you. So if we're not discussing these new issues, these emerging disruptors, AI, ESG, sustainability oversight beyond just financial, and I know there's a very big focus on financial at the moment in the sector, but the governing body has to think long term, and that means more than just financial. And the interdependencies between those things and what's happening in the sector that might affect all those interdependencies between financial, environmental, social aspects of the governing body's role, and how they all play together. So bringing your experience, bringing your questions, bringing your insights about everything that's going on into the HE sector is really, really important. And most governing body colleagues and executive team colleagues in the institutions will welcome those insights, will see the benefit of the depth and breadth of your experience. So don't be sucked into thinking, I can't go outside of the normal discussion. Ask those difficult questions. I was always the one on the governing body that asked the difficult questions. And I saw a few wry smiles on people's faces when I did ask those questions, but they were also very welcome. And generally, governing bodies like challenging questions. It helps them think. So that's it for me for the moment. I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions. Next slide, please, Patrick, to just reflect on around those three areas. Are the documents, charts, and processes making sense to you, or are you experiencing something different? Do you feel the balance is right on the enablers, on the behaviours and culture, and on how you and the rest of the governing body are adding value? And do you have those opportunities to be future focused, to think about formative discussions, and to bring breadth of experience from beyond the institution into the institution? And while you're reflecting on those and thinking about any questions you'd like to ask, I'll hand over to Alison to add her insights and experience to my thoughts. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you. Just note the last two words, right now. That's going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about. Could we move on to the next slide? Thank you. I think you know everything about me other than the last bullet point, which is possibly the most important for us here today, which is that I'm just in my first year as a new member, therefore, just of the board of Harper Adams University. So I've been going through the induction process. I would say that in my experience, and certainly with Harper Adams, it takes a year, a full academic year or the year that you joined, for that induction process really to sort of move you through and give you insights. And also it gives you time during that year to actually ask for information, to meet people, to get to know the campus, whatever it is that you feel would help you actually as a board member. I'm now going to move on to the perfect storm. Well, fortunately, Rachel earlier on today has actually covered this material brilliantly, because actually I'm now 3 minutes over time from when I should have ended. And I will just share with you one of the experiences of being a board member. It is so dense at times across the agenda that more often than not, the chair at some point says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, we're running about 15 minutes late. And we really need to progress our way through these papers." And you have to make that difficult decision as to whether you put your hand up and delay everyone. Well, I realise that's what I'm doing now, speaking to you at the point where you really should be asking your questions. So forgive me, I'll race through this. So the perfect storm, you have joined boards at the point, or governing bodies, at the point where as I think was said by Rachel, there really is a different feel about the concerns across universities about the environment. And why the perfect storm? Because of the current financial pressures, reduced real value of student fees, because of this situation with recruitment. Some universities really struggling with home recruitment, some actually, and nearly all with international student numbers down. And the situation we find ourselves in with the unclear policy for the new government. So with this, did any of you expect to join an institution at the point where potentially we're all different, every institution, but where potentially your institution is in quite serious financial trouble or really concerned about sustainability? So as governors, we're actually at this point in time really quite responsible for the health and the future of our institutions. What do I feel that means for me? Well, one thing it certainly means for me is I want to understand the context, hence those references, and you'll get these slides. Rachel mentioned the university's UK blueprint, really interesting for framing where we are now as a sector. And the other two, you'll see that there's a wonk HE commentary, but actually if you want to, you can sign up to Wonk HE. You get a Monday morning briefing, really helpful in providing context. And again, HEPI, Higher Education Policy Institute, sign up, you get, in fact, it's a daily blog, and you can pick and choose what you want to read. I would really recommend for any of you that haven't done this, it's a brilliant way of actually finding out what is going on in the sector, what the issues are. So moving on, and the next slide, actually, picking up on this point, you need to understand student recruitment. It's really complex. It's not just a case of budget numbers and then filling them. There are all sorts of steps along the way where numbers ebb and flow of students who are going to actually finally enroll. And again, I think Rachel showed us that balance of international home, undergraduate home. I really find that until I do understand and do really appreciate the challenge of the student recruitment, then as a governor, it's quite hard to react and respond. And then, of course, student retention. So when they arrive, do they stay? Do they move on from year to year? Because if they don't, that's a loss to the university, every student, of over £9,000. It's serious. But more important, actually, is the impact of the student experience that underpins the success of the university. And unless, as the last speaker was explaining, you feel that you understand student satisfaction, student support, then really you're not working with what is the core raison d'etre of the university and why and how it's going to succeed. So moving on to the next slide. This fairly obvious. How are you going to actually engage and respond to where many institutions find themselves working their way through the perfect storm, as I've called it? Clearly, most of us as governors, our interaction with the university is centred around governor meetings. And so agendas and papers, as we've heard, risks, issues, absolutely key to the way in which we can engage and respond. But also on your agendas, I hope all of you have got at some point a vice-chancellor or principal in Scotland and executive information provision that gives you real insights into the sector, into the institution. It's an absolute key part of the agenda, and hopefully a part of the agenda where you are able to ask questions and follow up. You heard our chief exec of the higher education, the statistics agency. Well, that aside, KPIs and understanding them is so important. And I would suggest that if you haven't already, as part of your induction, you actually ask for a specific insight into not just the KPIs, but actually the sources of data and the information, because actually for you, understanding what information is available is sort of a key part of your ability to then respond and ask questions. And it goes without saying that the strategy you need to know, you need to understand the expected outcomes. You need to be given the chance to both develop and to challenge at times the strategy. And then many of you already and will have the opportunity to join committees, huge opportunity to then understand in more depth. So moving on, and rhetorical questions, because we have 1 minute left to wrap up this session. So these are some of the questions that I would have been asking, which is, what's your experience? Anxiety, cost reduction exercises, student concerns. It's not easy at the moment. You've joined a higher education governing body at a time when there are a lot of challenges. So good luck to us all. But I feel today has been really helpful for me, I hope for you, in actually sort of preparing and giving me ways of moving forward. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you to you and Kim for being very adept at kind of squeezing what you had to say into a slightly smaller slot than was anticipated, and for also almost sharing what you've rightly described as will need to now be kind of sort of reflective questions for after this session, because we're at 1 o'clock. But we will send those out, and I should say, if there are any things that people want to follow up on, either specifically with speakers or more generally with Advanced HE, do feel free to get in touch with us. I just wanted to finish off by really perhaps going back and saying we knew that in a 3-hour session we were going to throw quite a lot at you, and some of it I think will hopefully have kind of really made a lot of sense. Others, it may be things that kind of come into focus as you attend a few more meetings, but ultimately being a governor, I hope you will find is a rewarding experience. Because when higher education institutions and universities are run well, they can provide transformational experiences for the students that go through them, for the society that are enriched by our research and our outputs. And, you know, they are, I hope you'll agree, a kind of force for good. So being involved in helping them to be run well, governed well, I think is a very valuable thing. There's a QR code for those of you that have got 30 seconds spare. If you're able to just to give us some feedback on the sessions you found interesting, anything you perhaps didn't find so interesting, that would still be useful to know. Any thoughts on the format? There's only 5 or so questions. It will really only take you less than a minute to complete that, unless you want to type in some more detailed comments. So without further ado, thanks so much for your time today. Do feel free to stay in touch. And as I mentioned, we'll send around the slides either later today or tomorrow, and wish you all the very best for the rest of the day. Thank you.